Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about David Ireland's play, Sadie. So this play suckered me in the best possible way. Initially, I was not that sold on it because it seemed like it was trying to do a whole bunch of different things, and it didn't feel like any of them was quite complete enough, right? It didn't feel like any of them was focused enough that I could really say, all right, this is what the play is about. Then we got the end of the play, and everything came together, and it all made so much sense. And it's really, 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 really well done. That's super, super cool that Ireland was able to do that. It's an incredibly difficult technique. And I will say, this is an in-your-face play, the way that Ireland's other plays are. I've talked about that in my other videos about his work. And I think it uses that violence that physical violence and sexual violence, in very purposeful ways that I think are actually consistent across Ireland's works that I've read so far. In that, the twist at the end, the thing that we didn't necessarily see coming. So Sadie she's a woman in her 50s, I think. 40s, 50s. Yeah, in her 50s. And she has this imaginary relationship with her Uncle Red, who had died 30 years earlier. I say imaginary. She sort of keeps up conversations with him. She engages with him in her memory. And her memory of him is basically quite a sort of jolly, convivial guy who, even though the rest of the family are Protestant, unionist, very staunch East Belfast, Ulster Scots. Red is a communist. He's an Irish Republican. He believes in the reunification of Ireland, etc., etc. So he's very much sort of the exact opposite of the type of people that the rest of this family are. These are the type of people who join the UVF, for instance, the Ulster Volunteer Forces, which was one of the Protestant unionist paramilitaries during the Troubles, whereas Red he denies being in the IRA, but his view of the Troubles and of the sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland is more aligned with the objectives of the IRA than with the objectives of the UVF. So throughout the overwhelming majority of this play, Red is in Sadie's memory this really sort of happy, upbeat guy who is very trustworthy and likable to the point that his staunchly Protestant and unionist members of Sadie's family actually enjoy hanging out with him, and like her now ex-husband, who has also died, Clark, like he would sit with Red and they would sing rebel songs together, right? The types of songs that galvanized support for the IRA. Clark, who was in the UVF, would sing with this guy. So he's that type of person, right? Who in Sadie's memory. But what we find at the end, we get this bit where she's talking to her therapist. And they're talking about Red, because it comes out in this therapy session that Sadie killed Red. She accused him of being a spy for the IRA and stealing a document from Clark that he was holding on behalf of the UVF, when in fact she had stolen it. And so she initially sticks a hot clothes iron onto his face and then convinces Clark that he is a spy. Clark ties him up, and then Sadie ends up shooting him to death. And what it... Myred, which I'm probably mispronouncing, it's an Irish name, I guess. Mairead. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it properly, and I forgot to look it up before making this video. She says, "You say that he loved you." Sadie says, "Yeah." Myred said, Did his love ever cross a boundary?" Sadie says, "I don't know what you mean by a boundary." Myred says, "Was he ever inappropriate with you?" Sadie says, "He didn't abuse me, if that's what you're asking." Myred says, "That's what I'm asking." Sadie says, "Well, he didn't." Myred says, "Okay." Sadie says, "It wasn't abuse. It was love. He was never violent. I wanted him. I adored him. The world might call it abuse. I don't." Myred says, "Tell me what happened." Sadie says, "He loved me." Myred says, "What do you mean by love?" Sadie says, "Just love. Love." Myred says, "Was your relationship sexual?" Sadie says, "Yes." Myred says, "Okay." Sadie says, "That was part of it." Myred says, "What age were you?" Sadie says, "I was 7 when it started. It went on until I was 12. Myred says, "Okay." Sadie says, "It was my fault." Myred says, "Why do you say that?" Sadie says, "I seduced him." Myred says, "When you were 7? Sadie says, "That's right." Myred says, "Sadie, a 7-year-old can't seduce a grown man." Sadie says, "I knew you would say that." Myred says, "A child cannot initiate sex with an adult." Sadie says, "It happens." Myred says, "That may be how you perceived it at the time." Sadie says, "That's how it was." Myred says, "But it's still abuse." Sadie says, "It wasn't abuse. He didn't abuse me." Myred says, "So why did you kill him?" Sadie tries to answer this question. She can't. Myred waits. Sadie says, "If he did abuse me, that would mean my whole life has been a mistake. There would be no hope for me. I'd be a victim." Myred says, "A survivor." Sadie says, "The world would see me as a victim." Myred says, "It's how you see yourself that matters." Sadie says, I don't want people to pity me." And I think that exchange is so revelatory, because so throughout this play, we've had Sadie's sort of memories of interactions with these people that seem to cross over between memory and reality, because on the one hand, we know that Red and Clark are both dead, and so they exist in Sadie's memory. But we've also got Zhao, Sadie's boyfriend, who's in his 20s, and Myred, Sadie's therapist, who's in her 50s. But there are points where they interact with Red and Clark, which does raise these interesting sort of existential questions about what exactly is going on here. But we have these portions of the play in which Sadie and Zhao are talking about their relationship, and the sort of difficulties of trust in these relationships and how they don't necessarily want the same things out of the relationship. We have these bits with Clark and Red and debates about Irish nationalism, British unionism, the ways in which Northern Irish sectarian conflict functions, etc., etc. And so all of these things are sort of brought together, and what I think, and they're brought together at the end, right? Because they seem throughout much of the play to be different strands, right? These interpersonal relationships between Sadie and these people in her memory, the interpersonal relationship between Sadie and Zhao, the issues of sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland. They don't seem initially to be connected, but when we find out that Sadie is more prepared to see herself as a person who seduced her uncle at age 7 than she is to see herself as a victim of circumstances in which she did not have power. That need for agency, right? That's really, really significant here. And it does seem to undermine her potential relationship with Zhao. But I think it deeply, deeply connects to some of David Ireland's seeming ambivalence about Northern Irish Protestant unionism. And that's a tough call, right? Like I'm to a certain extent imposing these sort of ideas or concerns onto Ireland that he may or may not quite agree with. But his work seems to reflect it, this ambiguous nature of the hardcore Protestant unionist communities of East Belfast, South Belfast, that Ireland comes from. And we see this particularly in a play like Cypress Avenue, which really raises these associations between psychopathy and the violent destruction of family and of a future out of the commitment to this sociocultural, political, and religious position. And I think Sadie is doing exactly the same kind of thing, in that need to see herself as the agent rather than the victim. What I think is going on that's so interesting is this critique of Ulster unionism, in which Ulster Protestants, Ulster unionists, who by and large are of Scottish descent, lowland Scottish descent. This is my ancestry as well. One strand of my ancestry is lowland Scots, Scots-Irish, etc., etc. Almost certainly Scots-Irish, though I don't know for sure. Someone came from Antrim in 1720 or 1722. Anyway, but this sort of idea of like, that it's better to be an agent of immorality than a victim of abuse, I think is really interesting in reflecting on the Northern Irish Protestant psyche, because the Scots-Irish, by and large, were basically cleared from Scotland and sent to Ulster Plantation in Northern Ireland, in what's now Northern Ireland. At that point, it was Ulster, the province of Ulster. And while, yes, that did mean economic opportunities for them, that did mean opportunities to own land that they couldn't necessarily have achieved in Scotland itself, they were part of an English colonial project in which the Scots-Irish, well, the people who would become Scots-Irish, Lowland Scots, were essentially deployed against native Irish Catholics for the overarching benefit of the English crown, later the British crown, that continued to, at best, poorly represent the interests of most common people in Scotland, as well as most common people in England, it's worth saying. But this sort of idea of that Ulster unionism depends on this idea of the commitment to this colonial project as opposed to being willing to see oneself as a pawn of the British Empire, in which the Scots-Irish are as much victims of the colonial project as Irish Catholics. I think there's a very, very strong, deep, and fascinating parallel with Sadie's desire for agency, even if that agency involves the belief that she precipitated a sexual relationship with her uncle when she was 7 years old.